All right, welcome everyone. Thank you all. Okay. Thank you all for coming today to the Environmental Law Institute, and for those of you who are listening online for our discussion today on the state of compensatory mitigation. My name is Catherine Campbell. I'm a staff attorney here at ELI, and I've also managed the National Wetlands Awards program here for the last 3 years. Now today is actually our awards ceremony, and later this evening at the U.S. Botanic Garden we will be hosting a ceremony for our 5 winners today. And this event is part of our celebration of the awards and for EPA's American Wetlands Month. So before we begin with the panel, I just wanted to briefly introduce or recognize our winners before we start the discussion. So first, we give out 5 awards this year. Our Conservation and Restoration awardee is Gregory Kearns. He's a naturalist with the Maryland National Park and Planning Commission, and for 35 years he has led wild rice restoration efforts and outreach at the Tucson River. Our Education and Outreach winner is Dana Pounds. She's the founder and executive director of Nature's Academy, a science-based outdoor education program in the Gulf Coast of Florida. And then we have our Science and Research winner, who is Dr. Robert Twilley. He is a professor at Louisiana State University and executive director of Louisiana's Sea Grant program. And then we have our state, tribal, and local program winner, who is Collis Adams, and he is the administrator of the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services Wetlands Bureau. And we also have Alicia Mosen, who is our community wetlands leader, and she's led the Sasko Brook Pollution Abatement Committee, where she has led water quality restoration and oyster bed restoration in her community. So you can learn more about them on our website at www.nationalwetlandsawards.org. And congratulations again to our winners. So with that, we'll turn it back to our panel and our discussion on compensatory mitigation. Our speakers today are going to present on a variety of aspects of compensatory mitigation. They'll be talking about different types of mitigation and providing some insights into what providers, developers, and others involved in the mitigation process can expect kind of in this recent climate of regulatory uncertainty and economic uncertainty. So our first speaker is going to be Karen Bennett. She is a partner at Clark Hill in the Environmental, Energy, and Natural Resources Group, where she has focused on permitting compliance, litigation, and regulatory policy related to the Clean Water Act, among other areas. She will be giving us a refresher on mitigation regulations and some updates on recent changes there. Next, we'll hear from Collis Adams, who is one of our winners this year. And again, he is the administrator of the New Hampshire's Department of Environmental Services Wetlands Bureau. He will be talking about in-lieu fee mitigation at the state level. Next, we'll hear from Donna Collier, who is manager and founder of Valencia Wetlands Trust. And she is also the chairwoman of the new and National Environmental Banking Association. And she will be talking about some market challenges for mitigation banks. And then finally, we will hear from Vince Messerly, who is president of the Stream and Wetland Foundation. And that is a nonprofit in Ohio that provides mitigation services for developers. Now, after we hear from our panel, we will open it up to discussion and any audience questions. If you're in the room, please wait for a microphone to come around before you ask your questions so those online can hear you. If you're listening online, you can ask a question through the webinar to the go-to question box. Please do not hold your questions till the end. Submit them as soon as you think of them, and then we'll read them aloud at the end. With that, I will turn it over to Karen to start.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. I'm happy to be here and participate with my esteemed colleagues on the panel, and I'm anxious to hear, I think, your contributions. My job is probably the boring part, to provide really just a little bit of a background and context to the discussion. Here we go. So I wanted to, and I think most of you on the phone and in the room are familiar with this, but just for anyone who isn't, the whole notion of compensatory mitigation really derives from the Clean Water Act Section 404 program, right? If the Corps is going to authorize impacts to waters, they then have to make sure that you first avoid, minimize, and then mitigate for any unavoidable impacts. And this process is really laid out in the regulations found at 404B1. We all consider those, we all are familiar with, call those the 404B1 guidelines. Sorry about that. So the whole notion then of avoid, minimize, and mitigate really played out sometime after 1989 when President George Bush established the policy of no net loss of wetlands. And that was really a programmatic goal. It was not applied permit by permit, but the goal of the wetlands of the Section 404 program was to comply with the 404B1 guidelines and use that analysis to minimize effects and minimize impacts on wetlands. What we saw over the next 3 decades really was an expansion of that policy and an evolution of the compensatory mitigation program through changes in regulations and policy and guidance issued by various administrations over time. The no net loss of wetlands was eventually expanded to apply to wetlands and streams, and eventually interpreted over time by the agencies to be a permit by permit analysis, such that a permit, it became a requirement that every permit that was issued would not result in, would maintain this no net loss of wetlands and streams. So it really did evolve over time and expand over time. In 2008, I'm really just trying to hit the high points and the most significant regulatory changes. In 2008, I think that is the culmination of a whole host of changes and a kind of a sea change in thinking about compensatory mitigation. Prior to that, you often thought of quantifiable ratios, 1-for-1. The Corps of Engineers had a lot of discretion in making decisions about what that ratio should be. In the mining context, back prior to 2008, it was very unusual to see mitigation ratios, in the 4-to-1, 3-to-1, 4-to-1, and then they inched up closer to 7-to-1, and that was considered kind of the high point at that time. In 2008, the rule then, the Corps and EPA issued a joint rule that really changed the way the agencies were and industry was really looking at compensatory mitigation quantification. It took on a much more qualitative analysis, looking at replacing the function and value of that water in a watershed, more on a bigger scale, and so the analysis became much more functional as compared to just the quantifying. I've got 3 acres of wetlands, so I need to replace that with 3 acres of wetlands. or a mild stream or whatever. It also changed the mitigation hierarchy and established a preference for mitigation banks and in programs, and then lastly, permittee performing on-site mitigation. And so this was a real change in the program. Prior to that, the preference was really on-site in kind. And I did a lot of work at that time for mining interests who did all their own, did all mitigation on-site for the most part. It was a very significant change to now be suggesting that the preferred approach was, go to a bank if a bank is available in the watershed and that whole thing. And so it was a real change for industry to adjust now to this new approach. And I think that, and it was a discretionary rule, so it wasn't like in 2008 there was a red line drawn in the sand and everything was new. In a lot of places there were no mitigation banks, and so what happened after 2008 that we're going to talk about was it opened up a lot of opportunity in the mitigation. I call it the mitigation industry. I mean, it opened up a lot of business opportunities and a lot of opportunities for groups like probably represented here in the room to get involved in mitigation. And so that's what happened, and we're going to hear about that. So this process that already existed sprung up and was I think refined and improved, and over time the banking industry and pushed on that, and I think Donna's going to talk to us about how that has evolved, how that process establishing a mitigation bank has evolved. But from industry clients, that most of my work is in that space, it was a real challenge, because it was this new world where now, instead of coming forward with what in your application with what you're proposing to do, what the applicant is proposing to do, now you're having to look outside, and you're having to find appropriate mitigation that would be acceptable to the authorizing agency. And it became a challenge, and I think there was a lag in availability, and which the lag in availability drove the cost of credits higher, and so there I think now we've gone through some period of growth and adjustment, and some of this is working out, but so initially, when you had this push from the agencies in that direction and you didn't have the available credits, you really had a real conundrum. And it caused delay, and it caused increased costs to permittees, and there are a lot of negative impacts on industry, I think, and a lot of positive impacts on an industry that was emerging. So I think, and then late in the Obama administration, late in 2015, toward the end of the Obama administration, President Obama issued new executive order, and which really it was a directive to the public land management agencies, and telling them to revise their mitigation policies. This expanded the notion of compensatory mitigation, which prior to this had been really in the context of the Clean Water Act Section 404 program. Now those concepts avoid, minimize, mitigate were now laid on public land management agencies and applied to other statutes. And there was a lot of pushback. There was a lot of people felt that it was unlawful. So it really did expand these concepts to now, from just impacts to waters, to now impacts to land, to wildlife, and other ecological resources. So it was a pretty broad expansion of the compensatory mitigation concept, and there was a lot of angst, I think, caused from industry and permit applicants, and you guys can speak to. At the same time, I wrote a client alert on this memorandum and said, there's some, setting aside whether this is an unlawful expansion, let's talk about opportunities that it creates, because I really felt that it did create opportunities to talk to the agencies about voluntary approaches to mitigation, thinking more broadly about what are the broader ecological assets that I might have, in my land holdings, that, might be assets in a permit negotiation, right? So I think that while there was a lot of negative, and resistance to that memorandum, I think at the same time it kind of broadened the discussion a bit, and maybe got people who knew they were going to be living under these new policies, got them thinking maybe a little more out of the box about, mitigation just generally, and what were the opportunities to really, look at your own land assets and look at the impacts of your actions and see what you could, how could you creatively address some of those voluntarily, and so I, then with the election, kind of changed things with respect to that particular guidance, because the new administration very early on signaled that it would be taking a look at all of these policies, along with other things. And I'll talk really briefly about the other things that I think position us for where we are today with respect to this. So first off, Congress also got involved and has moved to overturn the compensatory, the Fish and Wildlife Services mitigation policy that was issued in final form. That was in February of this year. And then that action was really followed by the administration's actions, which was a Trump executive order, followed the next day by Secretary Zinke, really looking at a whole host of things, but for our purposes, looking at the Obama memorandum directing the land management agencies, the public land management agencies, to revise their mitigation policies. And these two actions from the new administration really signal that there's going to be a change. And in fact, they are marching forward to reach out and identify and bring everything back for, another look and potentially a rescinding and revision of those policies. So we're, in addition to that, in terms of thinking about, so we're a little bit in flux with respect to what mitigation policies will look like going forward from these agencies. That process, I think people should be getting engaged in soon. But even in addition to that, there's two other things I think we should be all watching that will affect kind of the status of compensatory mitigation, and that is the administration's action on waters of the U.S. So federal jurisdiction over waters and wetlands will change. It's inevitable. When Administrator Pruitt in implementing this, Administrator Pruitt directed the agency to pull back the Obama final waters of the U.S. rule and revisit that and take another look under a Scalia relatively permanent waters test versus anything that's connected pretty much. But so you are going to see a change in in federal jurisdiction. So that will affect the need for mitigation. So that's one thing we all are watching, I'm sure. And then the other thing is that, Administrator Pruitt, coming from where he comes from, he believes that environmental regulation and environmental regulatory programs should be administered at the state level to the extent. And so he is encouraging a push from, federal regulation to more of a state level regulatory program. And so the most recent action I think that's worth looking at is this NACEPT report that was issued on May 2nd. And that's interesting because it looks at the NACEPT, which was an Obama NACEPT subcommittee, but finalized now in May. So it's reflecting this administration pushed it forward. And it looks at, what waters would be considered federal waters and what waters are available then for states to assume jurisdiction over under state 404 programs. So it's pretty interesting. You'll see there's still tension as between the Corps of Engineers who they have their own, they registered their own opinion in a minority report. And then vis-a-vis the NACEPT report, which reflects EPA's comments and I think their agreement in that approach. So that's interesting and worth watching. I think out of that, I think you will see that more states will look at and consider assuming that program, and then mitigation, again, will change. I don't see that there would be any less compensatory mitigation if that were to happen, if more states assume the program, but it would be a different dynamic, I think. So with that, I will pass then to my colleagues, and you guys can maybe pick up on that.
Well, thank you for having us, Catherine. Thank you, Karen, for the overview. It was very, very nice. And it's a nice transition because I can relate because I served on the Consumable Waters Subcommittee.
You did?
That developed the report. Very, very interesting. It was unfortunately not a consensus report.
Right.
We're not going to get there based on the fact that the Corps of Engineers saw it totally different than most of the states and tribes who participated in it. So that's kind of a nice transition. Sort of into my talk, but you sort of addressed it at the 30,000 foot level, and that's really nice. I'm going to bring it way down, bring the sideboards way in, and talk specifically about how New Hampshire deals with compensatory mitigation, primarily through an in lieu fee instrument. And so I'm just going to go through briefly some of the history and how we got to where we are today, and how that program has functioned over the last 10 years that it's been in existence. I've got a few statistics that I can share with you to show you the success that the program has enjoyed over that period of time. So I'll start with just a little bit of a background. It's called, in 2008, August 2006, I better look over here at my glasses, maybe turn my bifocals. August 2006, when we formally adopted what was called the Aquatic Resource Mitigation or ARM Fund in lieu fee option. So this is that was the beginnings of our contemplating how we're going to deal with the unavoidable loss of aquatic resources, both wetland and stream resources. So let's start by talking about what guided DES, that's New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, which is the organization that I work for and represent here today, and our in lieu fee program. So it came about as a result of some legislative action. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well, and as well as adopting administrative rules to move the mitigation option forward after having considered, as Karen had mentioned, avoidance and minimization. We still have to make sure that those steps are not overlooked in the process before we get to mitigation. So avoidance and minimization was critical. We're also looking at the federal mitigation rules, as Karen talked about, and as they had evolved. And then in the end, what we did was we adopted an in lieu fee instrument in coordination with the Corps of Engineers, the New England District of the Corps of Engineers, as well as Region 1 of EPA, which involves, of course, district engineer oversight and approval. We also developed an interagency review team and a site selection committee team that I'll talk about as I move through the presentation as well. So what are the ARM Fund goals and objectives? Well, we needed a way to increase the extent and quality of the compensatory mitigation we were getting. Originally, we were looking at on-site in-kind replacement, as was the original intent of mitigation for wetland loss. It was a miserable failure. Let's face it. It just did not work. There was not enough good projects that came about. We saw plenty of attempts to replace by size the loss of wetlands, but what we ended up with was a lot of small kettle holes alongside interstate highways that had cattails in them. Was it a wetland? Sure. Providing any reasonable function? No, it did not. They're miserable failures, and so we gave up on that fairly quickly. So we began talking with the Corps of Engineers about another option to do this, and they originally were looking towards promotion of mitigation banks. So we tried that. We had a couple of private entities come in to look at developing mitigation banks, and unfortunately those two were miserable failures, and there's a number of reasons for that that I'll touch upon as I go through my talk here. But these are some of the other goals and objectives, everything to conserving important wildlife habitats, to restoring wetlands of significant regional and statewide importance, including terrestrial habitats around vernal pools, headwater streams, and those sorts of things that we've heard a lot about as we look at the attempt to sort of roll back the clean water rule. We looked at implementing some of the best management practice to reduce pollutant loading in Great Bay, which is one of the most valuable and productive estuaries on the eastern seacoast. Even though New Hampshire only has a very limited, small amount of seacoast, about 17 miles, it is home to the Great Bay estuary, which is a very, very productive and high quality resource. And we look at salt marsh restoration as well as managing riparian buffers. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Aquatic Resource Mitigation, or ARM Fund as we call it. As I mentioned, we realized that we needed another option other than mitigation banking, which was not successful. As I mentioned, we had a couple of entities that came forward, tried to develop mitigation banks, but New Hampshire simply doesn't lend itself to a mitigation bank. New Hampshire is dominated by bedrock geology. There's a reason why New Hampshire is nicknamed the Granite State. It's because we are dominated by bedrock geology. We also have very steep topography. The White Mountains are very, very rugged. So we have very little land that lends itself to developing wetland banks. Because let's face it, if you can't get the hydrology right, you will never be successful in creating a wetland bank. It's all about hydrology, hydrology, and hydrology. If you're dealing with bedrock and steep topography and relatively small areas of flat, open spaces, you're not going to be able to come forward with meaningful wetland banks. And as I say, we tried a few. They were miserable failures. We said, well, what are we going to do now? So we rolled down to the next level that was being recommended, and that was the in lieu fee. So we set out on this journey to develop the in lieu fee through the Aquatic Resource Mitigation Fund. what it does is it provides an opportunity for applicants to pool money in watershed accounts, if you will. They're sort of like independent banking accounts. Each watershed where projects are built and there are wetland losses, there is a payment that's made into the account within that watershed, an in lieu fee payment. Those monies are then pooled together and they're spent within that watershed to make more meaningful improvements in the watershed, whatever those might be. So if we look at it, we sort of have a ledger sheet. Here's the losses we experienced. Here's what types of losses. Here's the type of resources that were lost. When it comes to using those in lieu fee funds, we need to match those up with the losses that were incurred during project developments. In other words, stream losses were matched with stream loss projects developed through in lieu fee monies. So the monies were gathered up into accounts for each of the watersheds. Each year we'd send out a request for proposals for groups, organizations to access this money to develop and build projects within the watershed to replace some of the lost functions and values that were realized during project approvals and issuance of permits. In this way, we're able to make much better and much more meaningful improvements within those watersheds. They're used from everything for wetland restoration, preservation of upland buffers, wetland creation, aquatic resource improvements, stream improvements, those sorts of things. So we felt as though we're getting much, much better bang for the buck. Instead of taking a lot of money, dumping it into a bank and not being successful, or trying to create in-kind on-site mitigation and not being successful, let's take those monies, let's do something more meaningful with them in the greater watershed context. So talking about when mitigation is required, there's a number of things that would trigger mitigation in the state of New Hampshire. Impacts to exemplary natural communities, the Natural Heritage Bureau areas, impacts to state or federally listed threatened or endangered species. The one that we see most is any time that there are wetland impacts greater than 10,000 square feet in New Hampshire, those must be mitigated. So that's a threshold for wetland mitigation at the state level. As far as streams, anytime there's an impact greater than 200 linear feet for a perennial stream, that requires mitigation. Anytime there's impacts to an intermittent stream greater than 200 linear feet measured along the thread of the channel. So when you talk about perennial, we measure it with three parameters: the thread, left and right banks. On an intermittent stream, we're just looking at down the channel. So those are the thresholds that trigger the need for mitigation in the state of New Hampshire. Fairly straightforward, although I can tell you there was a lot of give and take trying to arrive at the 10,000 square foot number as well as the 200 foot number. So it wasn't quite as easy and straightforward as it seemed, but we were able to arrive at some numbers after much discussion with stakeholder groups, including developers, home builders, you name it. It was a rather lengthy ordeal. Okay, so we've gone through that. So how much mitigation is required? So we were able to develop a table with a set of ratios. Along the left-hand column, you'll see resource types, everything from a bog down to a general category of all of the jurisdictional areas. I can tell you that in New Hampshire, most impacts, New Hampshire is dominated by forested wetlands. More than 85% of the wetlands in New Hampshire are forested wetlands. So most of the mitigation we're doing is for forested wetland impacts, and so that ratio is 1.5 to 1. So if you were to impact 1 acre of forested wetland, you would have to mitigate with a 1.5 like mitigation. And then you can see the same, if you look across the top, you'll see the same for the ratios for creation, restoration, enhancement, and preservation of an upland buffer. In forested wetlands, the preservation of that upland buffer is 10 to 1. So for every 1 acre of wetland impact, you need to preserve 10 acres of upland buffer. There's some other stipulations there. The buffer must be continuously surround the wetland that you're trying to protect. That's the biggest one. So this is the table we developed, and these are the ratios that we use to determine the amount of compensatory mitigation that is required. So here's the big question. We know you're going to play into an in lieu fee account within the watershed. How much is it going to be? And this required a lot of coordination with a big group of stakeholders to figure out how much this was going to be, because now we're getting down to dollars and cents. We've got the developers, obviously, who want to keep that number nice and small. We've got the environmentalists who want to see it get bigger and bigger. So we're trying to find some place in the middle, some way to come up with a number that we can hang our hat on that has some rationale and some logic to it. So after much thinking and debating, we said, well, why don't, if we're not going to construct a wetland as it used to be allowed under the old scheme, the old hierarchy of mitigation, what would it take to construct a wetland? Let's assume that was still available to us. Well, okay, what would you have to do? First of all, you'd have to have an upland piece of land to do this with, because you need to take upland and turn it into wetland if you're going to create a wetland. So we've got a component of this that is land. So that's the second bullet down. That's the DRA, the Department of Revenue Administration in New Hampshire, has a land value for each town and each city within the state of New Hampshire, and it varies depending upon, that the demographics and the DRA values within those towns, from the very, very poor towns to very expensive towns. Obviously, the land values increase depending upon the DRA land value. Again, you have to multiply that by the ratio. So let's use 1.5 as the example here. So now we come up with the value that we're talking about, the land that we're talking about. Okay, so now the next piece that goes into the calculation is, well, okay, now we know we need what it's going to take to buy the piece of upland to create a wetland on this theoretical creation scenario. Now we need to turn that upland into a wetland. So that takes some construction costs, that takes some excavation, some materials, some plantings, a lot of things that would go into it to turn that upland area into a wetland. So we met with a lot of people from construction industry, from the wetland wetland banking industry, other folks. What does it typically take to create or construct an acre of wetland? And it came up to be about $65,000. So that's the number we came with. We adjust that annually based upon inflation and those sorts of things. So that's the number we started at. So that was our second piece of the equation. We've got the value of the land, the upland value that you need to turn into a wetland. We've got the value of the construction cost to turn the upland into a wetland. And then the third piece is the overhead for DES to administer the in-lieu fee program, and that's currently sits at 20%. So there's the three things that go into it, and we actually have an online calculator. That's the part down at the bottom here. It says CV Harm Fund Calculator. If you go to our website, you can actually click on the calculator, plug in the town you're at. It'll pull up the land value, and it'll pull up the adjusted acreage amount and the construction amount adjusted for inflation and increased costs of construction and those sorts of things. So it's a very handy tool. Applicants can go right to it and figure out how much it's going to cost them if they choose to go the in-lieu fee route. And it's very handy. It's been very useful and successful over the last 10 years of the program. This is just sort of a schematic to show you how this all works once the money comes in, how it comes in, how it goes out. As I mentioned, we put out a request for proposals to access these in-lieu fee monies within each watershed. Groups would send in a request for we sent out a request for proposals. They would send them in. We review those and make a cut, eliminate some of them that we didn't feel met certain minimum standards. We boil that down, and we'd ask the others, the readings, to send in a more full application, all of the details as to how the money was actually going to be used and expended, identifying who they are, who the easement holders are going to be, for instance, if it was going to be upland preservation. So there's a lot of detail that needs to go into this. Once that's done, it goes to a site selection committee at the Department of Environmental Service for review. Then it goes down to a site selection committee where they rank and score it and make recommendations. Those recommendations go forward to both the Army Corps of Engineers and the Wetlands Council, which is an independent council in the state of New Hampshire. They review those to make sure that they make sense, and that we've done due diligence in requesting proposals, evaluating proposals, and making recommendations for dispersal of funds. And then finally, once that's done, it needs to go to the Governor and Council in the state of New Hampshire for their final blessing. And then at that point, the funds would be distributed. You might have heard Rivets mentioned, I think, earlier, the Regulatory in-lieu fee and Bank Information Tracking System. This is just a screenshot of what it's like. This is how we track all of the impacts and all of the monies that come in the inflow through the in-lieu fee process. We developed this obviously with the Corps of Engineers. So that's it in a nutshell. I'm going to take questions now, Catherine, or do you want to wait till later?
We'll the end
Okay.
questions.
So that's the sort of history of it, and I'll look forward to questions later. Thank you.
So it's an honor and pleasure to be here. I'm always excited to be able to talk to people about wetland mitigation banking. It's become quite a passion for me in the last 16 years. So in 2001, I was fresh out of getting final plat approval for a 500 lot golf course development. I was feeling pretty good. I've been quite successful and was looking for a new site. So I pulled up in front of this site right here with a real estate agent. And this was one of the pieces of property that he was prepared to show me. And I looked at that and I thought, oh my gosh, who on earth is going to clean up that mess? Little did I know it was going to be us. So this is what it looked like in 2001 when we went there. It was a Louisiana Pacific sawmill site that they had abandoned. You see rebar, you see cement, there were rusty saw blades, pieces of equipment you couldn't even figure out what it was. A lot of asphalt, concrete, a lot of mess out there. There were cattle up on a backfield that had basically destroyed everything. So this is what we started out with. We went ahead and got it because there was contamination, there were fuel spills. We assumed a consent decree that Louisiana Pacific had to clean up the contamination. And because of that, we went ahead and did it. We got a good price because we took on all the liability that Louisiana Pacific had. This is what the log decks look like. They've been piling their logs up and irrigating them, and you can see there's a little strips of wetland between. That area actually had been filled over a period of 20 years by Louisiana Pacific. They've hauled in all that rocky fill that you see. We actually ended up hauling out about 250,000 cubic yards of this stuff over time. So we were cleaning this up, getting ready to do the golf course development, and the Corps of Engineers came to us with the Wetland Mitigation Banking Program. I'd never heard of it, which was surprised me because I'd been deeply involved in real estate development. He brought me a stack about 6 inches high of things to study, and so I studied it over about 8, 10, 12 months and decided to switch. I was trying to be an amateur wildlife photographer, so I was wandering around the site taking pictures and study the hydrology and the topography and where the water was coming from, and it looked like it really could work. So we got some investors excited about it and put together a prospectus and had our first meeting with the interagency review team, which is where reality set in. A couple of agencies on that team were nothing short of furious that we would presume to do this. And at the time, I was dumbfounded. I thought this was a great program. I thought they'd be happy. Compared to a 500 lot real estate development, I thought this would be a walk in the park, and it ended up being just the opposite. At the time, I didn't understand why they were upset. Our investors had second thoughts about what they were doing. It looked like it was going to be a lot bigger bite than we had thought, but we decided to go ahead. I've since learned that the reason they were upset is because when the public comment period expires on a public notice, most people don't realize that it goes silent. You think that you're giving these public comments and that everybody's got a say and it's all transparent and public and you know what's going on. What actually happens is when the comment period ends, everything goes dark. And unless you issue a FOIA request to find out what was in the permit, you can't find out. So we ended up losing credit sales and trying to find out why and where they went and couldn't find out. And eventually I had someone come from the Corps of Engineers on the side and tell me that the state agencies were selling mitigation to the developers. So we were actually losing credit sales to the agencies that were really upset at us. And at the time, in the beginning, we didn't realize this was happening. So in our organization, that's one of the priorities we're working on, is to make sure that we don't have interagency review team members and or other government agencies that are competing with taxpayer subsidized auctions and basically squeezing out the credit sales for wetland bank. So there's the guts and feathers. That's how the sausage gets made. This is what we ended up doing, is what it looked like while we were hauling things out. We let some contractors come in and they dug it out for free in exchange for keeping the materials that they ended up with after they had processed it. So we cut costs that way by letting the contractors come in and just take whatever they could create out of it. And this is what that spot looks like now. It took us 15 years to get there. We actually finished the construction last year and had our final assessment last year. There's another shot. That's where that cement was in the first picture where you saw the rebar and the cement. That's where the log decks were. And that's basically the overview of what we have now. So the in-the-ground process was a phenomenal success, and I personally did not expect it to be that successful. When we did this, we had wildlife come in that none of us had ever seen or heard of, and it's just teeming now with a variety of diverse waterfowl. We've got a great blue heron rookery, bald eagle nest, a lot of waterfowl that's on the natural heritage list in Idaho. This is actually North Idaho. So the actual science, the concept of wetland banking has been proven. A wetland bank, after you go through all this and you meet the performance standards, then they award you credits and then you can sell them. So the reason banking is so successful is you don't get paid until you got there. You have to do the work first, and you have to have investors who are willing to take the risk and put the money up front, and it takes years for them to get a return on their money. There's a picture of our little critters. We actually had someone climb up that tree and put a motion-activated camera up there, and we watched these babies get hatched and grow through the entire season. Yeah, this is a sample of some of the things that showed up. Had a big flock of tundra swans that was quite a surprise. You got babies up there being fed by their mom, bald eagles, ospreys, sailing seals. That black-necked stilt over there with the red legs, that was a real surprise. It's things I never heard of, much less I've seen. So we do tours. We let schools bring classes out, and we give them a piece of paper with I Spy pictures on. We go out and take pictures before they come of things that we know they'll be able to find. And if you've got kids, they're excited when they've got a goal to go and get, and they run around and they're all excited finding this stuff. And the instant they've got it all found, it's like this. They're no more interested anymore. So this was a way we found to get them interested, where they actually learn to identify things. We go into the classes and give presentations and have hands-on. They build nests and stick parts and pieces onto birds so that they learn to recognize them. So it's been a lot of fun as far as the expansion of the reach and the influence and the asset that we have become to the community. So now we get into the technical part. When you're going to do a mitigation bank, the most important part is the physical site. When we started studying why things fail, and they usually do, is that the site itself is not going to sustain a permanent wetland if there was not one there already. So when you're looking for a site, you need to find something that can be made to a permanent, self-sustaining wetland. Like you said, the hydrology is basically really important. You have a service area where they will allow you to sell credits. You have a banking instrument, which is basically the agreement that you have with the Corps of Engineers and EPA and other team members. And then you have the interagency review team, which comes and oversees everything that you do. So we're highly regulated, highly scrutinized. We do monitoring reports every year. They come out and check and look and make sure that our wetland scientists told them the truth. So you look at what we do. If you have several smaller impacts that all come to this drastically reduces the regulatory oversight, because they just have one site they're looking at, and you have all these little sites all around that come here, and this is actually a higher quality than anything that we have replaced. So at least for us, and I know a lot of other banks, there's actually a net gain to the environment. So this is a win-win all the way around. So the 2008 rule that they mentioned, these are the 12 legal requirements. In the National Environmental Banking Association, one of our main goals is to work to have these 12 requirements enforced. Right now it's not predictable. Wetland banks are required to meet every single one of these, and have been determined to be required to make it successful. And I believe that's why we are, because they do enforce all of these, and we do reach the performance standards, and we can't sell credits until we have. So that's what banks are required to do, and according to the 2008 rule, everyone's supposed to be doing this. So we're working to make sure that these same requirements are actually applied to other options, also improve the environment for everybody. This is the timeline that they have. This is not always followed either. We've had regulators say if I have to approve it within that time, the answer is no. So this is some of the challenges that you work with. The regulators all have different opinions about what should or shouldn't be done. So when you're going to look to do a bank, you've got to get your source of funding. And a regular bank, traditional bank, is not an option because there's too little ability to predict what your credit sales will be. There's too many steps in between. There's too many opinions. The Corps of Engineers has latitude. You've got different things like state agencies selling mitigation themselves, so it's too risky for a bank to do. So you have to get a private investor that's actually committed and willing to take the risk, which we're very fortunate we have. When we lost credit sales to state agencies, which is up in the millions for us now, we had investors that were really committed and stuck in there and helped us and continue to help us, and are determined to stick with it and even do more as we work out the kinks in the program. So you have to look at the cost of land, which they also mentioned is different in different areas. You look at the cost of the conservation easement. It took us an entire year to negotiate the easement. The Corps of Engineers worked word for word for word with the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, and our conservation easement was like that thick. So each word was parsed out between those agencies, and it goes hand in glove with the banking instrument. So the whole process took us 4 years from beginning to end, actually going through the permitting process. You have wetland scientists and engineers, you have the cost of construction, cost of long-term maintenance, cost of annual monitoring reports, cost of financial guarantees, and the manager's long-term compensation. The financial considerations for revenues, you can sell credits to highway departments, which is the biggest user of wetland credits in the country, power companies, airports. Airports are actually often not allowed to mitigate nearby because it creates waterfowl and interferes with the air traffic. We have a lot of home builders, individual homeowners. We're opening up new markets for endangered species banks and new markets for Superfund sites. So this is the assessment method that the Corps of Engineers assigned to us. We have all these 12 features that they go out and measure on our site. When someone is going to impact a site, they use these same 12 things, and they go and assess their site, and whatever the score is at the bottom, they come and buy that number of credits at our bank, which is really slick. In our case, the Corps recommended this, and they don't make us do in kind. So if it's emergent, you don't have to go by emergent. If it's forested, you don't have to go by forested. You just get your score and you go by that. And it actually makes for a bigger, more economically viable, diverse wetland bank in the end. So we were pretty happy with the process to do this. They're trying to spread this. There's getting to be more and more. This is called a functional unit assessment method. So you don't just go and build an acre of emergent wetland to replace someone else's impact on emergent. This makes it more economically viable, which is a pretty big issue for all of us. Other benefits that you get from banks is that the legal liability transfers to the environmental bank. Any other option that you do, except maybe an in-lieu fee, if it fails, you're continually responsible. You have to keep trying and trying over and over, and people have poured an awful lot of money out on the ground that did not actually be successful, so that's a pretty big benefit. You also get the one-to-one mitigation ratio for all types of wetlands in the primary service area, which we also talked about. Ours goes out as far as 2-to-1 in the outer areas. The permits are really slick. We've got it streamlined to the point where it can happen in like a week or so. We can sell blocks of credits at a reduced rate to like highway departments. We meet the federal highways mandate for the use of wetland banks. And wetland credits facilitate shovel-ready status for projects, because a highway department is going to be able to just come and say we're buying credit from this bank. They don't have to go out and identify a bunch of different sites and hope that they're going to be viable in the future and get all their engineers and their construction plans and build on it. It's a huge difference to just come to the bank and buy credits. This is our service area. Every bank is different. It's negotiated with the Corps of Engineers, and they are required to take into account the economic viability. And they did that here. They let us have a bigger service area because there's not a lot of development up there in North Idaho. So when we encountered the difficulties with the regulatory agencies, I started going to Washington with the National Mitigation Banking Association. Go back in 2007 to talk to the agencies about what was working and what wasn't. And when the 2008 rule came into effect, at least in our area, everybody went right on like it didn't exist. So the 2008 rule meant nothing. And I ended up on the board of directors with NMBA. And over time, we came here several times a year and talked with regulatory agencies, and we made a lot of headway in ironing out some of the misunderstandings and streamlining things and educating people about what wetland banks were. And then at the beginning of this year, a group of the original founders, past presidents, and board members got together and started the National Environmental Banking Association to serve the smaller banking industry. NMBA restructured and went towards the bigger company and the bigger projects that they were going to do and stopped their focus on the smaller banks like we had been doing. So we started the National Environmental Banking Association. We are now the largest association representing bankers across the country. We've got a very enthusiastic response and feel like we're going to have a strong voice to help promote the banking industry. We have a short-term free membership. If anyone's interested, you go to environmentalbanking.org and hit the Join Now button. And it's free for 2017. There it is, environmentalbanking.org. There's our contact information. If anyone has any questions or is interested in learning more, I'd be happy to talk to anyone. Thank you.
My turn?
Yeah.
Okay. How much more time do we have? We got good time?
Yeah, we're good.
All right, so just briefly, this is my contact information coming up here. I'm Vince Messerling with the Stream and Wetlands Foundation. We're based in Ohio. We're a mitigation bank sponsor and lieu fee sponsor, permitting responsible mitigation provider, and endangered species habitat mitigation provider. So we do a little bit of everything. We were started in 1992. We were one of the first mitigation bank sponsors in the country. Way back then, the policy, I believe, was called draft guidelines or some type of memo that the Corps put out at that point in time to establish what they called then pooled or consolidated mitigation banking. And then that evolved into 1995, the final draft guidelines, and then finally a rule in 2008. So we've been at it for a long while. We've done 12 different mitigation banks around Ohio, and one outlier is in North Carolina. And we're also a in lieu fee sponsor, as I mentioned before. We have 4 different instruments for in lieu fee mitigation in Ohio. That's another story we'll save for another day, but basically we have 2 for wetlands and 2 for streams and 2 different core districts. Sorry there. So a little bit about in lieu fee mitigation. I can probably skip over this a lot. Collis covered a lot of these things, but basically we're looking at selling advanced credits and fulfilling those credits, and then once we have credits that are in excess of those advanced credits, then those credits are essentially viewed in the same equivalency as mitigation bank credits. And so that's just a little summary for those of you who may not be familiar with mitigation through the in lieu fee program. In Ohio, we're a little bit unusual compared to most other states. We have a very robust isolated wetland permitting program. And if you're interested in reading what we do relative to the 401 program, this is the link on the bottom, and the top link is for what we do for isolated waters. So basically in Ohio, no matter how the waters in the U.S. shakes out, you're going to be covered one way or the other, for better or worse. And so that's me in a nutshell. I would be more than happy to answer any and all questions about particulars relative to in lieu fee, mitigation banking, permitting responsible, etc. But I think everybody here did a good job getting everything covered. That's the beauty of going last. And so I think we want to, if we can, move along to questions, and I'd be happy to answer questions. I'm sure the rest of our panel members would be glad to answer questions as well.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I guess first, we'll just open it up to anyone here in the audience who may want to ask any questions. And we'll bring around a mic.
Thank you so much for these fruitful presentations. I work for Ecotropics. We are a nonprofit that we help with projects in tropical areas of the world. And now, extractive industries in some of those tropical countries, they have strong territorial dilemmas between extractivism and sustainability. And I can see that you all have like a long tradition of removing barriers against all that sort of dilemmas. And so what can we tell to this group of stakeholders in those areas that they face these challenges of extractivism? What can we tell them? How can we go ahead with this sort of business model or mechanism that its work is being effective, it's definitely solving problems? And I would like to hear a little bit from you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody? You know, it's a process that's evolved over a long period of time as far as we're concerned. We've been doing this for more than 25 years. And so to just be getting started with the program, I think you have some great learning experiences that could be picked from in the United States as to how we've gotten things started. You know, it's never going to be perfect. I'm unfortunately convinced of that. I'd like for it to be perfect. I'd like for everything to work smoothly. I guess for better or worse, it's kind of a bar that everybody has to get over to be in the business of mitigation service providing. But there's so many different stakeholders. There's the public from the 401, 404 permitting process that has a vested interest if they don't want that project to be built next to them, to the permit applicant that has a lot invested financially to make this thing happen, to the regulatory community that it's their job to be stewards of the environment and to make sure that everybody's doing the right thing. And then, of course, then you have the mitigation service provider that's trying to appease everybody at the same time. And it's like having a family argument. It's really difficult to get everybody in the kitchen table to say yes at the same time.
I would just add to that, just recognition that this all is derived in a legal prohibition on doing anything in waters here in our country without a permit, and then the requirement of the permit is that you avoid, minimize, and mitigate, right? So there is that framework in place, and I don't know what you have, what you're operating under. I think it would be pretty hard for all of this to spring up without some kind of an organic statute with those kinds of legal requirements that drive where we are today. And,
you know, for better or worse, our organization, when we got started, we were actually started by a group of developers in Ohio. They were all members of our Ohio Home Builders Association, members of the National Home Builders Association. And they figured out early on in the regulatory process after the Bush administration issued executive order of no net loss, that they weren't very good at doing environmental compensation. They were pretty good at building roads and streets and houses, but not so good at mitigation. And when this draft policy came out in 1991, they came up as an association thinking, hey, this might be a way for our members to be helped by the association. Unfortunately or fortunately, the solution at that time was, let's start a separate nonprofit organization, and that's what we are. That's how we were born. And the driving force then was to have a program that became a win-win-win as much as possible. a win for the public in that they got a natural resource restored that they could use as a recreation area, as an opportunity for hunting and fishing, but also for educational opportunities and research. The economic development, I look at the Environmental Law Institute motto up there that's a healthy environment, prosperous economies, and vibrant communities. And that's what they were looking for. And so at the same time, the last win was having an option for mitigation that the regulators could rely upon because they got put in a pickle a lot of times because they're trying to authorize permits that they really didn't feel could be fulfilled or met with the compensatory mitigation that was being provided. And so we were trying our best to solve those three dilemmas and let people move forward and have vibrant communities and vibrant economies.
Well, if you're trying to put a program together and get some regulation together, it sounds like that's what the dilemma you're dealing with. Is how do you convince the people that this is the way to move? Yeah. This is the direction you want to move in. We still go, and I personally still go back to something that you got to talk to people in words that they understand and in things that they can feel and they can touch that impact their lives every day. So I always like to focus on three things, and that is clean water. Everybody needs clean water. They understand the importance of clean water. Flooding, everybody's susceptible to flooding, the damage that it can do, and wildlife. Everybody loves wildlife, and wetlands and wetland programs provide all three of those important things to everybody, regardless of your socioeconomic position in life. And I think if you keep hammering on those, it's something that people can touch, they can see, they can feel, they can easily understand, and it place real value on it.
I think she's right. You've got to have the underlying regulations. People would not come and buy anything from us if they didn't have it.
No, some countries, they do have a hierarchy mitigation. That it's not sometimes like a law from the Congress, or sometimes it's more like a ruling from the executive side. But either way, they do have in place, but it's the public, let's say, lack of explaining these complex things in a very easy manner for them to understand. So public, they go not so they say, well, they're gonna build a mine here, and it's going to rip out all of the wetlands around the area. And those countries, they have highest biodiversity sometimes. So the politically of those things start to play, say, oh no, don't do this project because people don't want. And then you have corporations that they invest a lot on getting pre-licensing or doing the screening of a greenfield project. And then their country say, well, people don't want this project. They've already invested like $500 million on an environmental licensing procedure, and then they just can get a license because although they have those compensation rulings, people never seen this business model working out perfect like here in the States. So people is scared about this. They see, oh no, this is impossible. You cannot do habitat banking compensation. Show us one project and we believe. Because in those countries, how the extractivism industry works in the past. They out of there's corruption, and then the communities are left with nothing. So yes. One of our work is basically trying to explain this complex mechanism that even though it's already in the law, in rulings or in the law by Congress, people don't get it. So we go out and try to explain how does it work like a gold mining company that it needs to do extraction, but at the same time they're doing with international standards of environmental safeguards. And then people start to realize that, we understand what this gold mining company does. We can go ahead and start with a small compensation project, see how it works, and then they start to rely on this type of schemes.
It depends on reliable enforcement. If you don't have that, the whole thing falls apart.
Yeah.
You have a question in the back?
Hi. I actually have a question for like three people. I kind of went down the line. I'll start with the lawyer at the table, and if any of the other of you are lawyers, I can only tell because of her name.
They're hiding it.
Okay. My first question for you is, pending either approval, currently the 2015 rule that was issued by EPA has been enjoined, yet mitigation continues to thrive. So my question is, honestly, this executive order can't change what the Supreme Court has said about the waters of the United States. We know that in Rapinos there was no plurality opinion or majority opinion. What really can an executive order or even this clean water rule from EPA do to slow down or damper compensatory mitigation at this point? Because before EPA decided to issue that in 2015, the company I've consulted with in the Midwest, they've been doing mitigation since the 90s. So, waters, how the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and how the states have, determined what the waters were, what waters, required permits. I'm kind of not seeing how this rule that's currently enjoined is going to stop what has been trucking along.
So you're
these
right.
years.
The compensatory mitigation requirements are tied to the issuance of any permit. So my point, if it was misconstrued, my point was, there are a couple other things going on out there that may affect mitigation. If, for example, the new waters of the U.S. renders fewer federal waters, then you would assume then some actions may take place in areas that would otherwise have required mitigation because they would have otherwise been captured, or they may happen under some state program, right, somewhere. So it's not a direct correlation, just to point that, it's another thing that's out there that is going to redefine the universe of federal waters, and federal waters is what triggers the need for a permit, which then triggers the need for the compensatory mitigation at the federal level. So,
because
it's really just that, all I was saying.
I feel like even if Administrator Pruitt said, we're going to go with Rapinos and Justice Scalia's majority opinion, or Justice Scalia's opinion, it's still, I don't think is going to be a directive to the Corps of Engineers to say, stop. There's still Supreme Court precedent that has said, these are waters. This is what we consider federal jurisdictional waters. This is the connectivity. This is what I don't understand how, because I feel like if that came out and it was something that's going to be, detrimental to environmental resources, all of these organizations will sue. That lawsuit will go on. The rule will be enjoined. It'll go on for X amount of years. And I just feel like compensatory mitigation will still be very viable and very,
well, I think that's a different question. So I think that question is,
that was more of a
debate
statement.
over the defensibility of a new rule.
That was more
okay, so that's that.
Okay.
But then to your point about compensatory mitigation, I think you're right. I mean, to the extent that the Corps is issuing permits or a state is issuing permits, there will be compensatory mitigation for those impacts.
Absolutely.
It's just, will they be under the federal rule? Will they be under some state program? But yes, I think you're correct that because we're now revisiting the extent of federal waters, doesn't really mean necessarily that compensatory mitigation is going to change.
Absolutely. Thank you. For New Hampshire, I'm sorry, I can't see your name, Mr. Adams. You did state that you all have an in lieu fee program, correct?
Correct.
I helped an in lieu fee program sponsor become an in lieu fee program in the state of Missouri prior to moving to DC. And I thought it was interesting to hear your approach, like from a state level, because in the state of Missouri, there's the Missouri Heritage Conservation Fund, and they have They had the only in lieu fee program in the state before this nonprofit organization created another in lieu fee program. For the nonprofit standpoint, you are issued advance credits. Is that how it's done in New Hampshire? I didn't hear you mention any advance. For example, in the state of Missouri, you know, in lieu fee program says you can put all this money into the pot, and then as you find sites, you put those sites on the ground. Is there a select amount of credits that your in lieu fee program can sell prior to having to put something on the ground? Like, how does it work for a state-run in lieu fee?
Well, we don't sell credits. It kind of gets stood on its head.
Okay.
We kind of accept the fees first, and then we go through a process of distributing those monies. Now, we have to work within the rivets, the reporting process, and within that process, there is a way to equate the payments to credits.
Okay.
So it's built into that process, but ours is kind of, like I say, turned on its head. We accept the monies first, then we expend the monies.
That's very interesting because the state of Missouri accepts it and then they hire their own contractors to go out and find the land and put it on the land, and then they expend the funds for whoever. Instead of the bidding process, I think they just kind of select. I've never seen their bidding process. So it was just very interesting to hear how you handle that. And I had a question. So under the mitigation rule, you know, there's 3 growing seasons or 3 years to put things on the ground. Have you found in your experience that it's been difficult to meet that timeline, or does the state regularly meet that 3-year? And how would you even determine, and let me be more specific, for one project, if there's an impact and you say I'm going to mitigate it here and you offer that land up to the Corps as being the solution for an impact, you have 3 years from the time you take the money to put a project on the ground. Does that apply to whoever receives the bids that you all put out?
Well, the proposals would need to have a timeline built into it,
Mm-hmm.
and there's some monitoring requirements, there's some follow-up to it as well.
Okay.
And that's all part of the proposal that we would receive from the entities who are
Okay.
looking to access the grant monies. So there's that check in place.
Do any of them have a hard time with the 3-year, getting these projects on the ground within 3 years?
We're not
3
bound,
growing seasons?
we're not bound by that really.
Okay.
I can tell you most of the projects that get funded are land protection preservation projects.
Okay.
We look for restoration as much as we can. That's our first goal, is to try and restore as much as we can. But there's really not a whole lot of opportunity there for a variety of reasons. So the vast majority of our projects and our grant awards are for upland preservation. So, you know, we're not really dealing with that. But there are times when we need to put in monitoring and follow up and those sorts of things. And we do typically require at least 3 growing seasons. But with follow-up, and may need to be adjusted, we may need to modify the project to make sure that it's meeting its performance standards.
Okay. And lastly, I saw that endangered and threatened species were listed for you all. Does your bank serve as a conservation bank and a wetland and stream? Like, does it encompass it all?
No, I just use those as an example of where we might want to focus our attentions.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. I have a question for Karen and Collis, Miss Bennett. When you were talking about how the EPA may change the rules and give more maybe jurisdiction, for lack of a better term, to the states, what happens when a river, for example, runs through multiple states and then those states adopt different standards? What's going to happen then, do you think?
There's authority in the Clean Water Act for states to assume the 404 permit program. And I think there are a number of states that are interested in doing that. In the past, there's only 2 states that currently, Michigan and New Jersey, right?
Correct.
That currently issue their own 404 program, implement their own 404 program. But that's what this whole NASEC report is really about, is looking at how are we going to define what waters are federal waters. And so what you're talking about is interstate waters, right? And so those would likely stay waters of US under a delegated program would fall outside of the state. Yeah.
Okay. And then for Mr. Adams, I'm not very familiar with the whole banking or fee in lieu because I'm from Connecticut and we have a pretty small state and maybe not a lot of opportunity for this. But in any event, if I heard you right, you said that mitigation in New Hampshire is required within the watershed that the development is taking place.
Where the impacts occur,
Is
correct?
that correct?
Yes.
So now what happens, how do you find the land to do the mitigation on? Is that somebody's like else's private property? And then how do you bring that person in and have them agree to it and be part of all this?
Now, those are some good questions. They're complex questions, but they're good questions. So how do we go about that? Well, it's up to the applicant or the project proponent to go out and find land to be preserved that meets the qualifications and the standards. Now, a lot of times they'll just go out and flat out buy it, or they'll buy an easement that's held in perpetuity by an easement holder that has to be approved by the state. And they have to meet all of the various rigorous tests that they need to meet for being a qualified easement holder. So that's that whole process that they have to go through, and that all has to occur before we issue the permit. Now, sometimes we'll issue the permit with conditions that say, you need to work out some of the financial details before you can put the shovel in the ground, but at least you got your permit in hand, you can go out and get some financing for your projects and those sorts of things. So that's how we handle that. Does that answer?
Yeah, I was wondering, it made me think.
I wanted to get to your other question about interstate water and stuff.
Oh, well, before I leave that, it made me think of, there's a program in Connecticut where you match like a farm with a farmer or a farmer with a farm, because there's so many of these small farms and the people are, they want to retire, but there's new farmers and they don't have farms, so there's like a matching program. I wonder if the same sort of idea could be applied here, where there are willing private property owners who would want mitigation to take place on their property, and they could put their name on a list, and then there'd be a readily available place for this to happen.
That's a good concept and one that I think warrants some further consideration. We're certainly always out there encouraging municipalities to go out and work with landowners to make them aware of the program and perhaps come up with what we call their top 10 wish list. If money were to become available, do you have restoration projects? Do you have land acquisition projects that you'd like to have, so that they're geared up, they know what they want to do, they got a way to approach it so that when the money's become available, they can sort of have a leg up on perhaps other folks and get into the program, get started in the program. So I think that's similar to what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So we're out there trying to get those, trying to create those partnerships sort of loosely behind the scenes before something actually comes forward to us.
Okay.
But I wanted to comment on the assumable waters. The interstate waters, I think, are fairly straightforward, that those are retained by the Corps. What's really difficult are the waters that have multiple core districts with them. That's get really difficult because each district has different waters that they've identified, traditional navigable waters they've identified, the way that they approach it. So it's those waters or those rivers or those streams that go through multiple core districts. May not all be within the same state, but within multiple core districts, it gets pretty complex.
Hi, my name is Catherine Shepard, and I am a contractor who actually works in support of NOAA. And one of my questions is about aquatic and submarine mitigation. We are not seeing a lot of in-kind mitigation happening for impacts to things like coral reefs or seagrasses. And there's a lot of, I think, high risk in these habitats, and there are issues with who owns the land and stuff like that, because you're also looking at states, and you can't really purchase land that might be in an estuary, right? Because it's underwater, so it's state-owned land. What is the role of mitigation banking in that type of environment, and what are things that could be done to help incentivize seeing mitigation banking coming into some of these habitats and ecosystems where we're not seeing it happening? Like, I don't know what the role of risk is or incentivizing for that. But I'm just really curious, because that's a struggle. Something we're struggling with is seeing a lot of out-of-kind compensation in these environments.
I can answer that. When you're looking to do a mitigation bank, you've got to show investors or whoever's going to fund it where the market's going to come from. If you had a market there, you get a bank. If it's going to be in kind, that's really risky for a banker to go and do. If they don't know where the sales are going to come from, you probably would not be able to get that. But if you had sales there and you could get an advanced contract, and when you achieve these credits and you've got your performance standards, you would get a banker in there to go do it. I would go do it.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Simpson. I'm with Restore America's Estuaries. And first, thank you to all the panelists. I found this very informative this afternoon. And my question is more to what Karen had mentioned about this change into the qualitative analysis of wetland functions in mitigation banking. And then also, Donna, you had that nice slide up about the different assessment kind of methodology that you look at in my projects. So my question is, how are those particular functions that are monitored for determined, what those different wetland functions are, whether it's water quality or key habitat for species? And the reason why I asked that is whether carbon services could be included within that. Wetlands are one of the wetlands functions is carbon sequestration and storage, and I don't know if there would be interest and appetite to include that as a wetland function that is mitigated for. So I just wanted to kind of get your opinion on that.
So it might be more of a question for someone like Vince or Donna. So the tools, right? It's the Corps has functional the tools that look at that. As applied to estuaries, I don't personally have any experience with that, so I don't know what those tools would look like.
The Corps actually has a different assessment method for different areas of the country depending on what the ecosystem is like, and they basically tell you what system to use. They are working on something they call credit stacking, where if you wanted to add more ecosystem products to that, you could, as long as you're not double dipping and selling something twice. But that would need to be built into your banking instrument with the assessment method, and be really clear what your performance standards are when you get your credits awarded, and that you're not double dipping and selling twice.
You could add functional assessments for anything, not anything, but it would have to obviously be related to what you're doing. But so if you wanted carbon to be a tool that you were using to evaluate the success or failure of that project, you certainly could come up with some type of mechanism to use to evaluate that and determine whether or not you're meeting your goals. But as Donna is referring to, stacking credits or bundling credits is, I think, more of what you're looking at. And so a habitat restoration project, whether it's wetlands or uplands or forest or whatever, or estuaries, all provide a suite of functions. And so most mitigation banks and NLUP projects use an acre surrogate. And so you have to get away from that, in my opinion, if you want to get into looking at the functions and values and evaluating it. Provides this much carbon sequestration, this much nutrient retention, this much sediment retention, this much flood attenuation, and you would take all those different components and come up with a measurement for those and determine how those can be used as a compensatory mitigation product for applicants that need them. Goes back to the other question, you have to have that market. Is there somebody that really needs carbon? Is there somebody who really needs sediment retention and wetland mitigation? And how do you analyze that? Some states have figured that out, not very many. Again, the big mental block is getting over the acre surrogate and how do you, the double dipping conundrum. folks look at that and think, oh, you can't sell the same thing twice. And so you have to divvy it all up into different elements and components.
So that'd be something decided more at the state level.
It would be, or at the core district level, yes.
And I think there are institutional barriers to that kind of thinking.
Yes.
There
I
is.
think in the science community, there are models and things, consultants have models to look at all of that. There's these, selling that to the core as an acceptable approach and something that they feel comfortable with. I think that's probably where the challenge is, and we're just not there.
Some people thought we were a scam in the beginning. We thought it was a scam. It took some time for them to look and see what we did. And we did a video that we put on our YouTube channel to show the before and after. And I had several people come and say it brought tears to your eyes and changed their whole attitude. So part of our problem is education, so that people understand what a really good program this is.
Well, and also it takes time. So you need time-lapse photography to really tell your story, because otherwise there's a period of faith.
Yeah.
When you expect it's going to come, but there is this time.
They were used to a lot of failure, and they expected us to fail. So it was a shock for them to see how well we did.
Yeah, the end-of-fee concept had the same perception problem. When it first was promoted, it's like, oh, they're just buying permits. You just tell me how much to write the check for, and you're going to give me my permit. So we had to convince folks that, no, we're actually making them show beyond the shadow of a doubt, if you will. They had avoided to the greatest extent possible, had minimized, had explored all other options available to them, and end-of-fee payment was only the last option. So getting over that perception image was very difficult, and it took some time, but I think the success has paid dividends and brought a lot of people around to seeing the benefits.
It looks like the program that you did has turned out really well. North Carolina did a statewide end-of-fee that ended up with $200 million in unfunded liabilities. And they're buying credits to make up all of that. And now they've gone to banks, so they didn't get their program put together as solid as apparently what you did.
Hi, this is Owen McDonough. I'm with the National Association of Home Builders, and I had a question that kind of keys into the 404G assumable waters, as well as the 2008 mitigation rule. So it's a little bit technical, but I think it's worth exploring. If states get delegated authority under 404G for the waters that are determined they're able to assume, is there any mechanism in the 2008 mitigation rule that would enable them also in turn to get delegated authority over basically the mitigation rule or the mitigation banking instrument process?
Oh, so the banking part.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
A question came across my desk this morning from a member, and I thought, well, this is the perfect place to ask it.
Oh, well, so.
Then we'd still have to follow the rule. It's still in effect. It's not like if they're delegated that.
To follow it. What we see is they're not. So.
But it just really, so your question though is,
let's say Pennsylvania gets
G provide authority for the banking part of the rule.
Correct.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Of the greater picture. I never thought about it.
Never thought about it, but would have to.
Just as a 180-degree difference is the 401 program. There are 4 states that don't operate their own program, and there are 46 states that do. And so, but those states that operate their own 401 programs still have to follow the federal 401 program and that baseline. They can be more strict and more stringent, but they can't be less strict.
Oh, yes. So no doubt about it. If a state gets authority to run its 404 dredge and fill program, it still needs to meet the requirements on all quotas. But the question is, does the 2008 rule for mitigation, can you get delegated authority basically to sideline the Corps from the process and the state go through its own mitigation rule separate and apart from the federal government?
I'm not a real attorney. I only play one in a movie. But no, I think they would it's still a federal rule that they would have to follow.
Okay.
They would have to meet the minimum criteria for it.
Yeah, so they have to set up their program, but I thought you were asking something different. I thought you were asking about the banking piece of the 2008 rule.
Yes, that's
So
right.
you're asking whether the preference hierarchy
Yes,
in
if
the
they could.
2008 rule
Does the 2008 rule apply
applies
anymore if you
to-
get delegated authority under
applies
404?
to a delegated program. Right. That's what you're
It's
asking.
a brain teaser, but we should probably talk offline. I think we're already running over time here, so
There
I'll
seems
get
to
back
be a
to Catherine.
perception that if you turn it over to states, it's going to be more honest. We have not discovered that that's the case. You end up with the same problems on a state level with the regulators that you do on federal, at least. So I believe as they do delegate things to the states, they've got to have real clear guidelines and rules. We have programs being set up within states under state authority, under the umbrella of federal regulations, and their state programs don't meet the requirements of the federal. And both EPA and the Corps are disturbed because some states have set things up supposedly under their authority, and they don't meet those guidelines. So there's a lot of things to work on out there.
Yeah, the banking piece may be a bit of a challenge for a state to assume the program.
Okay.
But the bottom line is, if the state's going to assume, they have to execute an MOA with both the Corps and the EPA, and that mitigation piece would have to be teased out before that MOA can be executed. Now, how they do that, I don't know. I guess we'll learn as we go along. The more states who have banking as mitigation try to assume the program, then we'll find out. But I think that MOA will have to address that piece of assumption.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, again. We are going over time a little bit, so I hope that this conversation can continue. We will be posting the slides and the presentation today on our website at eli.org, so I encourage you all to go there and reach out to our panelists to ask any questions that we weren't able to answer today. And with that, we will end, and just thank you again, everyone, for listening and being here today.
Thank you.